Hello everyone, welcome to Tortoise, welcome to our regular Friday lunchtime Sensemaker Live Think-In. My name's Giles Whittell, I'm an editor here. I'm also a white man of a certain age, and I think I'm more aware than ever that statistically I'm probably in the demographic that is least personally likely to have reason to mistrust the police. 6 days ago, as most of us know, an event that was supposed to be a vigil on Clapham Common in memory of Sarah Everard turned into something rather different once police moved in to try to prevent it becoming a rally and an event in honor of a woman who had died in a case in which the prime suspect was a serving police officer, became footage broadcast everywhere on a loop of women being held down by police officers. Last night on the news at 10, we heard that 1 in 40 women aged 16 to 24 had been victims of serious sexual harassment, including rape and penetration, but only 1 in 6 of them reported those events to the police. Meanwhile, as is evident in one of the slides that we've just seen, there is, and you'll excuse the journalistic shorthand, I think probably a crisis of trust in the police amongst certain ethnic minority groups. Although, I think we'll talk about this, there are 2 types of trust. Trust in police's ability to do a job and trust in police's instincts to do a job. Now, for the next hour, this conversation is going to be part of a larger one, which we sort of started in a sense on Tuesday. We're going to continue next month. We'll have a think-in devoted more specifically to questions of safety for women and girls on streets, universities. So I hope that today we can focus more on this question of police and the trust in the police. And our framing question, can police restore public trust? And I'm hoping that we'll talk about leadership, we'll talk about police culture, recruitment, and resources. And of course, as usual, for those of you who've been to one of these before, pitch in. That's the idea, to get everyone involved, either in the chat or by raising your digital hand and speaking. As you know, our goal is to listen carefully, scribble hard, and get story ideas, which we will then pursue in more conventional journalistic ways. We're really lucky to have with us today Helen King, who at the moment is principal of St Anne's College, Oxford, where I think, Helen, you also studied some time ago, but Helen is also a former Assistant Commissioner for Territorial Policing at the Met, and I believe is the first former police officer to lead an Oxbridge college. We'll be joined a bit later by Umesh Desai from the London Assembly. But first, Helen, if I can come to you, just big picture. I'm now very old, and I remember when I was a teenager studying for a Spanish O-level, and one of the non-linguistic cultural things there was a brief primer on Spanish police, the Guardia Civil, if I can dig up my accent. And we were told that, partly as a legacy of the Civil War, they were loathed. And I think universally in the classroom, we were proud that the reverse was true in England. I was raised to know that our police were rather unusual in being unarmed and in commanding the overwhelming trust of the public, being popular. As I say, our framing question is, can the police restore public trust? Recent events indicate that there is a crisis of public trust in the police. Do you think that's true? Are we starting from the right place? And if so, what would be your practical response if you were still in a position of trying to do something about it?
Okay, thanks for that, Giles, and thanks for the opportunity to talk at more length than is normally possible on these issues. I don't know if everyone would have shared your view of the police in your teenage years, and I wonder if there's some rose-tinted spectacles there. Public trust in the police needs to be high because the police are in this very unusual position, if not unique, of being entrusted with powers over their fellow citizens in a way that most professions aren't. So although I could point out that Ipsos Mori polls would show that the police are held in much higher trust than many, many other professions, including obviously politicians and indeed journalists, that's not to say that we shouldn't be worried, because trust in police, as I say, is key because of those extra powers that the police have, because we have, as you say, a very unusual policing model in the world. There are only 4 police services in the entire world where officers are not routinely armed. And personally, I think we should have as much pride in the British model of policing as we do in the NHS and other great institutions. But of course, many people don't feel that way. And the fact that certain ethnic minority communities, particularly Black communities, lack trust in the police is a real concern, as is if women feel that they can't go to the police with, because of course nearly all women at some point in their lives very sadly experience harassment or threats of violence, or at least live in a way as if violence is something that they need to adapt their lives to avoid. So trust in the police is really important. I think one of the problems we've really got at the moment, and this is evident to me in some of the ways the police's actions at Clapham have been portrayed, and I'm not an apologist for the police, they don't always get it right. I can't hand on heart say everything that happened at Clapham was right. And I've probably sacked more police officers than just about anyone else in the country, so I know about some of the things that happen and have to be dealt with. But I think there is a real gap in the public's understanding and the willingness of the public and indeed journalists to explain what is happening from not just a police perspective, but what are the police here for? You know, the police are entrusted by the state to use force when it is necessary and unavoidable. And if you've got laws, someone's got to be able to do that. I don't think there's a country in the world where there isn't a police service or force of some sort. So one of the things I went out in the media and spoke about in the last week, you've described men holding women down at Clapham and officers holding women down. And one of the things that is very misunderstood is that if an officer needs to use force to effect an arrest or a detention, once that decision is made, and of course that decision has to be justified, force should only be used if it's necessary and only the minimum amount necessary. But once that decision has been made, actually the safest way to arrest someone, the way that officers are trained, is that in an ideal situation, you actually have 6 officers to do that. One takes charge of each limb, one takes charge of the head, and one overviews the safety of everyone involved in that incident. And in that way, you minimize the risk of anyone, including the person being arrested, of being hurt. And the reason why people get taken to the ground to be arrested is there's lots of evidence that when you're standing up, it's very easy for somebody to fall over in an uncontrolled way, to bang their head, to sustain injuries in that way. Now, that means not only that you have the headlines that we've seen in the last week, but also on a routine basis, if someone needs to be arrested in a public place, the police officers are doing what they're trained to do, they're taking the safest approach. The crowd around them then misinterpret that situation as the police being aggressive being over the top. And then when a crowd gets very worked up, you've got the risk of public disorder. You've got the risk to the officers of being attacked by bystanders. Those bystanders then find themselves liable to arrest and being taken through the courts. And so this kind of misunderstanding over something that is very simple in terms of what is the safest way to arrest someone who isn't complying to avoid them being caused injury has massive ramifications. And I think there's some onus on the police to try and explain this much more clearly. And I do know that there are some officers in the Met and elsewhere who are trying to do that, inviting community members into officer protective training sessions. But, you know, I hope that there would be more people, including maybe some of the people who are listening today and yourselves, who would be prepared to step back and say, oh, I didn't understand that. Okay, let's try and understand more how the police need to do their job to keep the public safe, because that is what the police are there for.
Well, that's completely fascinating. And like my colleague Phoebe in the chat, I had no idea. And doesn't that raise the follow-on question about leadership in relation to Clapham? If we accept the argument for 6 people per arrest, Cressida Dick will have known that there was the potential for a frankly horrendous optics event. And so the question arises, should she have insisted on different ground rules for the whole event? I know that hindsight is 2020, but doesn't it raise questions about the bigger thinking and the planning for the whole event? Okay,
so let's unwind. And I have to be upfront and say I've got no inside knowledge on this. It's just my interpretation of what I've seen and read. And also, I'm not an expert on the law as it currently stands. It's changed so often, I've got another job to do, so I haven't gone through the minutiae. But my reading of what I've seen is at the current time, there is no exemption in the coronavirus regulations for protests to be exempt. Last year, when there was various protests, there was an exemption in law. And of course, it's the politicians who set the law, not the police, and rightly so. So in this instance, there wasn't a legal provision to say, okay, legally, this is how a big gathering can be run. There was then an application to the High Court. Mm-hmm. And my understanding, but there'll be lawyers who can give you a better view, is that the High Court in effect said that the police could show some could determine that this event could be allowed to proceed, but it also backed the police's position that there wasn't any exemption in law, there wasn't a right for this event to happen, and that the right to protest is a human right, but there are other rights that can trump it, such as the right to life. So the police, I think, there will have been a command structure in place. Cressida Dick wasn't the Gold Commander. I think there's a Deputy Assistant Commissioner who took that role, who will be public order trained and very experienced in making strategic decisions about how you weigh up different human rights considerations and different priorities. Came to a view that the organised event couldn't happen. And my understanding is legally, that's right, there is no legal exemption. So if the police have decided to use discretion on this occasion in terms of allowing organisers to go ahead with an event, given that government have put in place these very heavy penalties for anyone who organises large gatherings during the pandemic, then one of the questions I think I would then pose is, okay, for every other organiser who wanted to organise a large event, do you really want it to be the police who decides whether the law laid down by politicians should be overridden for this event Is that a police decision? So this week it's a vigil for Sarah Everard. Next week, maybe it's Extinction Rebellion. Maybe the week after that, it's anti-vaxxers. You want the police to decide which events should be allowed to go ahead or not. And I would then want to go on and say, clearly there were vigils that happened all around the country in many cities, including at Clapham. And I think for about 6 hours that day, people came and went, they laid flowers, they had a moment of respect. I'd want a lawyer to tell me whether that was legal or not. Does that count as a gathering? I don't know. But the police stood back and they allowed that to happen as a proportionate response to that situation. As the event developed in the evening, so after dark, big crowds, speeches being made from the bandstand. From the bits I've seen on social media, I wasn't there, so lots of caveats again. But from what I've seen on social media, not all those speeches were about a vigil for Sarah Everard. Not all of them were even about violence and the threat of violence towards women. It appears there were people there, including a number of men who had their own agendas. Yeah. And you got a crowd who were densely packed. You got them chanting. You know, we know all the issues about droplets and aerosol sprays in the pandemic. And I just wonder if when the police went in, apparently to stop the speeches and to ask the crowd to disperse, if the crowd had cooperated and all gone home at that point, dispersed peacefully, would we then be criticising the police actions? Would we be saying, you know, that was a proportionate response to the pandemic threat. This had moved on from a respectful and relatively safe vigil where a proportionate decision could well be made to allow it to go ahead? Or was the police's objectives genuinely, and I think this is what they're saying, around public safety, and they were asking for the public's cooperation in that way? And could they have been criticised if they hadn't intervened in some way at that point, at what was an unlawful gathering with a public health risk?
Well, you raised some very interesting points. I mean, like you, I wasn't there. A number of people in the chat were, as I understand it. At about sort of 6 to 7, as darkness fell, it was on a knife edge between ending peacefully and turning nastier. Your point about whether we would want the police to have more discretion in how these kinds of events are policed, especially in these circumstances in a pandemic, is very salient, of course, because of the bill going through Parliament, which would give them more discretion, and it would also give the Home Secretary more discretion to allow or disallow protests without recourse to Parliament. And so doesn't that throw more of a focus on the instincts and habits of the police force? We talked a bit about leadership, but I wonder if I could come back to one other specific event on Saturday, which was widely reported, and you might think of as a one-off, but perhaps is representative. And it's this case of the woman who identified herself as Georgina, who saw someone flash her on her way home, and she went to some police. A female officer said, "Okay, fine," as in, "we'll try to do something about it." A male officer with her said, "We've had enough of the rioters tonight," and eventually nothing was done at the time. It was followed up subsequently. But if we're talking about the instincts of frontline officers as opposed to their commanding officers, is that revealing and troubling, as many people thought, or are we misunderstanding that too?
No, I mean, the officer who didn't report it has neglected their duty. It's a discipline offence for police officers. Complaints against the police are dealt with under a statutory framework. And if it may be, it's possible that there was a very good reason why that particular team of officers couldn't deal with it, but they certainly should not have left that situation without gathering details, without taking steps either for that team or some other colleagues to deal with the complaint there. Indecent exposure, it's a crime, it needs to be recorded, and it needs to be investigated. If there are lines of inquiry, then clearly you want to catch the person responsible. So I make no apology for that. I have no doubt they were tired, they were exhausted. It's not nice having a load of people in your face shouting at you, calling you obscene things, when you see yourself as a public servant who's here to protect the police. But there is no excuse for not taking a complaint of a crime and making sure that it's dealt with professionally and sensitively.
Okay, thank you. In a second, Tom, I'd like to just come back to your slides so we can whistle through them again. But you just mentioned, Helen, the sort of state of mind of officers at events like that. From your long experience of forces in London and elsewhere, how would you describe the sense of, I'm not being very articulate here. Do you feel broadly sympathetic towards frontline officers in these kinds of circumstances, or do you look at the footage and think that it's happening again and it's so easily avoidable? Because one thinks of serving police officers, especially women police officers, in circumstances like that, for whom it must be very difficult. But I think most of us with no direct experience of policing, and many of us without family members who are in the police force, haven't had a chance to sit down and hear it from the police officer's point of view. I mean, when that woman police officer went home after the Georgina event, how do you think she will have processed it? How do you think she will have explained it to her partner or whatever?
Yeah, I must admit, I don't know the detail of that event, but I'm sure she will have felt exhausted and dispirited. She may have very well have felt very frustrated with her colleagues in relation to the dealing of that report, and probably anxious about whether there will be a complaint and whether she'd be in trouble and all those things.
And what protections are in place for her if she wants to? I mean, it's difficult for her then to bring a complaint against her male colleagues, isn't it?
There are all sorts of ways that officers can bring up concerns against their colleagues, including, hotlines and so on. And actually, the vast majority of misconduct that leads to officers being dismissed is reported by their colleagues. That's something which a lot of people are unaware of as well. But the greatest proportion of police corruption or malpractice that comes to light is because colleagues report. Mm-hmm. Because, if you're a police officer, it is more than just a job. Cops call it the job, you job, his job. And that's because it takes over your life. You carry your warrant card with you at all times. You're obliged to act even if you're off duty. It becomes very much part of your identity. And so you're proud of what you do, and you loathe those who bring the service into disrepute, who abuse their power or authority and undermine your position. And you also feel, I don't think it's good for anyone for cops to feel misunderstood by the public. And you can say, well, they're being paid, it's their job to just take it on the chin and get on with it. But if we care about policing, and I think we really all should, then don't we want our cops to feel part of their communities, supported and respected by communities, not perpetually sort of deliberately misunderstood? We don't want our police officers to stereotype the public. Well, let's try and encourage the public to not stereotype police officers, but be prepared to listen, to respond constructively. And don't we want some of the most thoughtful, value-driven, principled people to want to be police officers, to see it as a profession to aspire to? You know, and again, this is, you know, of course I feel protective towards a career or an organisation that I spent 30 years in, but I really genuinely think it's in everybody's interests for us to try and understand each other better. And I've seen how the police over the last few decades has tried to get much closer to communities, understanding what their concerns are, and engaging with them. And if we could just shift the public and journalists and politicians and people like all of you who are listening today, to see it a little bit more from the police perspective, that we're asking them to do a really difficult job. You know, the police are never called when everything's going well. They have to intervene when society has already failed in some sense. So if we can just widen the debate and the understanding and the different perspectives that we all view these issues from, I think we'll end up with better policing, as well as the police feeling better supported.
Thank you, Helen. While you've been speaking, Lucy Huberman's made a couple of interesting points in the chat, including pointing out that most people do view the police as part of a wider debate. And that point on training, Lucy, would you like to have your say? And then we'll come to the slides.
Hello, Helen. I just wondered what, I mean, you may not know the answer, but what kind of trauma-informed training might the police forces have? Because obviously, you know, policing a football match is different from policing a vigil, is different from policing Trafalgar Square with Nazi flags flying. And I think what the public's reacting to, pandemic or no pandemic, is, you know, what they're seeing in different circumstances, because, you know, whether or not women and men went to Clapham Common to stir up trouble, on balance, it was a response to trauma felt by lots of people.
Police training covers a really wide range of issues, and more and more being issues being issued or added all the time, you know, in relation to disabilities, in relation to different cultural expectations and so on. And you know, I guess to some extent we all stereotype because it's a shortcut, isn't it, when you're under time pressures and being bombarded with information in lots of different formats, you know, particularly out on the street surrounded by people. So I think the police are becoming increasingly aware of the impact of trauma, particularly for victims of things like hate crimes and sexual offences and so on. I guess it and there will have been a lot of sympathy for the wider goals of the protest, or the vigil, obviously, and police officers, like everyone else, will have been absolutely sickened by what happened to Sarah Everard. I think there are some situations where that's really helpful, you know, when you're sitting down one-to-one with someone and hearing about their experience, and the way sexual offences, for instance, are dealt with now compared with back in the 1980s when I joined has improved vastly. I think when you're dealing with hundreds of people in a crowd in front of you, probably other things are coming to the forefront of your mind, and trying to keep your own nerves and your own calmness steady, you know, when in effect you're surrounded by a large crowd who maybe are presenting in a very hostile way. But as I say, you know, I'm not a complete apologist for the police at all. There is plenty that they can do better. There are individuals who have joined for the wrong reasons, or who are motivated by the wrong reasons. And there are also plenty of police officers who have experienced and are affected by trauma themselves. You know, PTSD is a significant issue within policing because of the nature of the stuff they're dealing with, you know, pretty much day in, day out.
Thank you, Helen. Let us, as promised, go back to the slides. And then when we come back, if Umesh is with us, we'll talk a bit about London. If not, we will do a little bit of a change of direction. And I want, well, we could talk about the difference between London and elsewhere in the UK anyway. But I also want to get on to the specific question of ethnic minorities, trust in police. But first, Tom, can we have another look at the slides?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So as we see here, the first two stats come from a recent UN Women UK report, which has been shared widely in the conversation, which surveyed a little over 1,000 women early this year, suggesting almost all women in the UK have experienced sexual harassment of some form. Sexual harassment is obviously quite a large umbrella term, and how people define that has been the source of difficulty in terms of how that then gets recognised and prosecuted. But in addition to that sort of really damning first stat, it also found that 80% of women of all ages said they'd experienced sexual harassment in public spaces. So quite a high level there for in public as well. And then the bottom two stats are for the incidences of rape specifically reported to the police. And clearly, you know, reporting of rape is thought to be around 15%. Obviously, 4% is the UN Women UK figure for reporting sexual harassment. But around 50% of rape get reported, and then that gets whittled down, sadly, to those bottom two very low stats. So as we move on, there are a range of reasons given in the UN Women UK report, from which, again, this slide is based, which reveal a range of attitudes showing that lack of trust in the police and justice system on the part of women on this issue for there to be any or really much at all accountability. That highest category of not thinking the incident was serious enough was put forward by 55% of women who have experienced sexual harassment, and not thinking reporting would help at 45%. Respondents were able to put forward multiple reasons. And of course, part of this reflects the wide definition of sexual harassment and how different forms are taken with different levels of seriousness by other people. So, for example, more statistics in that report said that 73% of women would report flashing, they would report that, whereas only 8% of women would think they would report someone pinching or grabbing their bum. And so the lack of trust in the police in responding to this issue is quite clear. So as we move on from sexual violence onto the police's relationship with Black communities and communities of ethnic minorities in Britain, interestingly, research from the LSE shows that the more contact people have with the police, however that contact is initiated, whether it's a member of the public or the police themselves, the less trust and confidence they are likely to have in them, which perhaps intuitively makes sense as well. Of course, there's plenty of evidence that certain communities, also in big cities and Black communities especially, are over-policed compared to the policing of other more rural communities, certainly. Interestingly, there was a poll in last year for ITV News which said that despite the widespread perception among Black communities that the police were biased against them, as you can see that statistic in a lot of other data and research as well, despite that perception, when asked in this poll, when Black people were asked whether they would be proud if a family member joined the police, still quite a high figure of 47% of Black people said they would be proud. The figure for the rest of the population was at about, it was 52%. So it's interesting to see that kind of how they see the institution has various layers to it. And if we move on, Yeah, so the bill currently going through Parliament is a huge bill and makes a lot of changes. Several crucial measures noted here relate to protest and were in direct response, a couple of them, to Extinction Rebellion's protests last year. So it's obviously interesting that as this crisis of trust in the police, which is whatever crisis of trust there is, has seemed to have built up over several decades from, of course, the Macpherson report in 99. Before that, undoubtedly, but the Macpherson report was a big moment in 99. And you had several other big news stories which called into question the institution, such as, the revelations around spy cops this decade. But just as this is happening and the crisis is coming to a head, the powers are proposed to be expanded. Obviously, campaigners have raised the question on that first point of what exactly, or the second point rather on this slide, what exactly public nuisance is, because that can seem to be defined very broadly. And so as we come on to the final slide, so this is quite interesting. The first stat refers to Ipsos Mori polling, which is the polling that goes back the furthest in time for how the public feel about the police's honesty. And so Ipsos Mori have been measuring that perception since about 1983. And it was broadly steady, around 50%, around the 50s, of positive trust in the police's honesty, whether a senior police officer or a police officer in public would be telling the truth. Do you think that they would, was the question. And then it was around the 50s and 60s as you came into the 2000s, and in the 2010s, I found this slightly surprising that it seems to have gone up into the 60s. YouGov also have been taking the same measure, and they've gone back just to the 2000s, and they were slightly lower in terms of positive trust. It was around the 50s, whereas it was the 60s at Ipsos Mori, and that's risen. Negative trust in terms of someone answering, I do not think that a police officer that I saw either on TV in public would be telling the truth, has stayed steady around 30% for the several decades up until the 2010s, and then decreased symmetrically. And this has happened just at a time when people's faith in the police's capacity has kind of nosedived across all the polling that there is, obviously very linked to funding. And so it's interesting to think about why that might be and why that trust and that honesty has actually increased, even though obviously we're living in a time of greater scrutiny and ability to see and monitor the police through technologies and social media.
Tom, thank you very much. We are now joined by Umesh Desai, Chair of the Police and Crime Committee at the London Assembly. Thank you very much. Hello, in the first half hour, we were talking quite specifically about issues related to last Saturday, but just from those slides, which I hope you got a chance to see some of, 1810 people from Black and ethnic minorities feel that the police are probably biased against them, but 74% of people broadly trust people to tell the truth, and that number's on the rise. In your experience within London, is there a crisis of public trust in the police? I can't hear you. Let's just make sure you're unmuted. I'm sorry. That's better. Thanks.
Now? Yeah.
Yeah.
I should have got used to this after a year. Firstly, good afternoon, everyone. And I do apologize for joining you a bit late, but we had a GLA budget meeting, which went until 1 o'clock. I saw some of the figures, but look, the broad issue, the big issue here is this. We saw the protests last summer around the Black Lives Matter movement. And then we saw what happened over the weekend, which have thrown into question many issues about how we are policed. We got the bill going through Parliament right now, as well. So certainly in terms of trust, confidence, it depends, I think, on which section of London or Londoners you're talking to. And certainly in terms of black and multi-ethnic communities, I think the issues still remain about how people feel, that they're policed. And this is a debate that is going on for over 40 years. It was actually before before the Macpherson inquiry. There's a report here, Policing Against Black People. This was actually published by the Institute of Race Relations in the mid 80s. 100 plus pages of evidence gathered from various community groups up and down the country. So has the situation changed? On the face of it, yes. I mean, there are more ethnic-minded officers within the Met and other police forces. But I took part in a debate just a couple of days ago with the ex-chief superintendent from a ethnic minority background. The fundamental issues within the Met still remain, and so. I mean, what do you mean by public trust? But I think there are serious issues of concern, certainly within the BME communities. But as we saw over the policing of Clapham, around which there are many sort of aspects that have been, that BME communities have suffered, the women being dragged away, and so on. The scenes that we saw on the disturbing scenes that we saw on television. So I think it's those issues that we've got to address. What do we mean by the divide between a policing framework and operational, policing, what's the line? Yeah. But in terms of, I think what you wanted me to talk about, policing of BME communities, the mayor's got his action plan on policing, which was a response to the Black Lives Matter movement. Earlier this week, he announced, this is quite a revolutionary step, community groups to actually monitor the use of stop and search, use of Section 60 powers. My report preceding that, which, and I'm the first one to say it was short on answers, but it was actually raising questions to frame the debate before the mayor's policing plan, action plan came out, was around 5 key issues. And okay, it was done in the context of race and policing, but I think it applies to policing of society as a whole. Recruitment, number one. But it's not good enough to recruit people from a diverse background, whether it's LGBT plus officers, women officers, BME officers. You could retain people.
Mm-hmm.
You could look at the figures why the police are still not retaining people that they put a great deal of effort in recruiting. So recruitment, retention, then training. What sort of training are we doing? Some say the answer is unconscious sort of bias training, which is what the Met are doing right now. So this, a considerable amount of money is being spent on training in the action plan that you announced, some 1.2 million pounds. So training, but then the very important part of the debate, the interface between the police and communities that they police, operational policing, Section 60, stop and search, the use of Section 60. I mean, the part of London that I represent on the police committee, we seem to have Section 60 operations virtually sort of every second day. I get tipped off, told in advance what's going to happen, and just this week I've had, I think, 3 or 4 emails about the use of Section 60 powers. And the last area, the most important, well, in many ways all important, but something that really concerns me is community engagement. Right now in London, and I think around the country, there is no structured liaison between the police and the communities that they're meant to police. In 1981, we had the Scarman inquiry and the Scarman report, which actually, amongst other things, recommended the setting up of police community consultative groups, which has statutory powers. And in the 80s, I'm not quite sure when they went out. They just gradually disappeared. But there was a structured mechanism in each of the London boroughs where the police community consultative groups resourced by the local council would meet in public, where committee groups, individuals could go and then actually question the police about operations, set the framework for future policing over the next few weeks, and over the sort of the period before the next police committee consultative group meeting. We don't have that anymore. In London, we've got safe
What
and
happened to
neighborhood. So I think a number of areas and I'll just say this in another context, right? But I think we are not going to much sort of broader areas. We lost the last Royal Commission on Policing in this country was in 1964, preceding the Police Act. Right? Society has changed enormously over those years, in every way that you can imagine. how many police forces we have. There's so many fundamental issues. And I'll finish on this note because I think you wanted me to talk about my work at the Assembly. So I'm chair of the London Police and Crime Committee. Before the lockdown, we used to meet twice a month. One meeting was about was question and answer with the Met and the Deputy Mayor for Policing. Sometimes the Commissioner comes and the Mayor of London. And another meeting was about looking at issues in depth, domestic violence, rape, convictions, hate crime. The first report in my chairship was on hate crime in the capital. And it's about looking at something in depth, the recommendations, structural sort of issues, stuff like that, and then monitoring the implementation of those recommendations. Sadiq Khan is the Police and Crime Commissioner for London. Our job is to scrutinize him and his actions. Mayor's Office on Police and Crime, and the Metropolitan Police. So that's my work.
Well, thank you very much. I want to pick you up on one particular point. You mentioned the part of the action plan, I think, is community groups to monitor the use of stop and search. That may not be structured engagement, community engagement of the kind that you wish we still had, but how is that supposed to work? Because stop and search has been such a lightning rod for mistrust, and it got Theresa May into trouble with her backbenchers when she tried to cut back on it. Now we hear that there's going to be more of it. What leverage do these community groups have, and how do they do their monitoring?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and it's in fact a question that I actually want to ask of the Deputy Mayor when I saw the announcement. It's been in the press. I mean, this issue of who represents whom, what sort of community groups are we talking of? There are monitoring groups in London. Are they well known? Who do they consult? How are they going to monitor? Is it going to be post stop and search? I mean, you can only do a big broad picture. Individual cases quite rightly get referred to the IOPC, the Independent Office on Police Conduct. So I think some people have said, that parts of the action plan are a knee-jerk reaction. I think the mayor is trying to actually address some fundamental issues to the best of his ability. There is a question of some things been thought through. I think on paper, I mean, look, let me just stop and search. And I've said this, and it may not be a popular position, but I'm not one of those people who want to condemn the police's use of stop and search. I think the introduction of body-worn video cameras is a game changer. The largest rollout of body-worn video cameras has been that one knows of has actually been undertaken by the Metropolitan Police. They protect both police officers and the rights of the people who are stopped and searched. And the families of people who lost loved ones, they are the biggest advocates of stop and search, but done properly based on on intelligence with the support of the community. Coming back to your question, I think it's a good idea on paper. The question is, who sits on who's part. Who are these committee groups? I want more details as a member of the scrutiny of the Police and Crime Committee.
And it's not up and running yet. We don't know the answers.
No. Who do they report to? I mean, are they going to do a big, broad sort of overview of stop and search operations? So I would like to see stop and search not on its own. It's going to be part of, as I said, the 5 points I outlined in my action plan, which is about race and policing. But you're looking at some fundamental issues of policing here. It's got to be done, as I say, by structures of community structured approach of community engagement with the police. People from all sections of say a particular London borough, women's groups, citizens' rights groups, LGBT groups, tenants groups, not there are many of them around in my part of London, but diverse sections of society, the local Chamber of Commerce. That's what Scarman envisaged in 1980, when his report I think came out in 82 or 83.
Now, you mentioned that it's been ages since we had a Royal Commission on Policing, and someone who identifies themselves in the chat as G. Herdale, I'm sorry, I don't know what G stands for, says there's an ongoing strategic review. Tell us about that if you'd like to. Is that going to do the job of a Royal Commission, or do you agree that we need collectively a wholesale deep breath, step back and rethink? Can we come to you, Ms. or Mr. Herdale? Hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Hi, it's Giles heard out, and so we're namesakes. Yeah, thank you. No, I think this strategic review isn't a government review. It's been organised independently of government by the Police Foundation, which is a think tank looking at policing issues, with various other people being part of that process. But I think it reflects the fact that there's been an absence of kind of hard questions asked about what society wants policing to do, when the kind of scope of policing has increased enormously since the 60s, just as society has changed beyond all recognition. So I think there are some kind of big questions that politicians have not really wanted to engage with, about what do you want the police for? How proactive do you want them to be? It tends to be, considerations around police policy tend to be very reactive to particular instances and events, rather than people looking more in the round at what's the point of this? What does success look like? And I think that's what the review is trying to ask some of those questions.
Do you think that on balance, as a result, the public are ill served, or police are put in an invidious position, or both?
I think there's probably a bit of both of that. I'm not here to, I can't speak for the police, but I think comments that others have made about the fact that they're perhaps, policing tends to be quite defensive often. It's put under the spotlight, and as a result, rightly, as a result of instances like the Clapham issues or Black Lives Matter. There's little chance for people within policing to express views more generally around what policing's for, and that's a debate that doesn't really happen in my experience.
Thank you very much for that. And Helen, I see you have your digital hand up, and I will come back to you in just a second. But I wanted to give Luke, my colleague Luke, a chance to talk if you wanted to say anything, because I did ask you in advance whether you wanted to, specifically on this apparently very high level of mistrust among Black and ethnic minority groups, especially, we know, young Black men in London. And an apparent disconnect between that and police regarded as an aspirational career choice in some ethnic minority communities. Are we in danger, do you think, of exaggerating the extent of a trust crisis, or the reverse?
Thanks for giving me the chance, Giles. I'd love to hear what Helen had to say, so I don't want to take time. But I think the point I've been trying to make is that there is a risk that you run, and it's dangerous to pan these institutions continuously and to paint them in broad brushstrokes. And whilst I agree with Zav, there's obviously it's critical that we keep up this commentary around the accountability of abuse in the police force, but ultimately we all have a vested interest in good, decent, empathetic, competent people being police officers. And I think we'd see a breakdown in many of the things that we hold very dearly if the participation crisis that we're already seeing in people from diverse backgrounds, people who are women, are to continue. So that would be the main thing. And I think that process is already being echoed in our government, and we don't want to see it spread elsewhere.
And someone did put in the chat a useful stat about the fact that whatever the national picture within London, the BAME population is not reflected in the BAME police.
Well, yeah. One thing on that, sorry, is that there's nothing inherently desirable about representation without the communication and leadership and other characteristics that ought to come alongside it. And I think there's a danger, as we've seen with the police force, that it's got such a strong internal ideology, such a strong shared culture, that actually there might be something harmful about that form of representation rather than beneficial. These things are obviously difficult to measure, though. It would just be something to be aware of.
Okay, thank you. Let's come back to Helen. We have a few minutes left. You definitely have the last word. There may be a number of things you want to pick up on, but is there a very strong shared culture, as Luke was saying? And in response to an earlier comment, do we need, first of all, to ask society again what they want of police?
I think that's a discussion that has to continue. And I've added in the chat, I'm actually on the advisory board of the Strategic Policing Review, which has the support of all the main political parties. And there's currently a call for submissions from anyone on issues including police legitimacy and accountability. So really want to encourage everyone, please Google it and send in what you think, because it's really important, there's wide engagement. In terms of relationships with ethnic minority communities, and particularly Black communities, and I would say particularly Black communities in London, it's a really difficult issue because there is such long-standing history, if you like, you know, and I think, you know, everyone in policing would accept that that historically there's more than just mistakes and individuals getting things wrong. That, you know, if you go back to the 60s, 70s, 80s, there were systemic issues that just were not recognised about how some communities were being dealt with. And I think what's now particularly tricky, and I found this going to London, it was very hard to build relationships anew with the strength of the narrative that had happened historically. And I hope I'm not expressing this too clumsily, but it imbues so many interactions. So an officer may have really, really good reasons why they're stopping an individual and needing to search them. And their primary motivation may well be because they have seen too many young Black men stabbed and murdered on the streets of London, and they're desperately committed to preventing that from happening. And they stop someone and they start a conversation and they're respectful and they explain what's happening. And the individual they're meeting, again, completely understandably and with some justification, immediately thinks, you're stopping me in the same way as you stopped my father, my uncle, my grandfather, all my mates who suffered this disproportionality. You're wrong. So I'm not going to really listen to what you're saying. I'm going to push back and I'm going to dispute. You're right to stop me and to search me. So you get this conflict. And, you know, sometimes the police officer won't be as sensitive as they should be and won't really understand where that individual is coming from. And sometimes that individual will be particularly fired up for whatever reason of what's going on in their lives. So you get this clash. But ultimately, the police do have the power, you know, the right to use force as necessary and proportionate to use their lawful duties. So you end up with yet another incident which adds to the narrative that the police can't be trusted to police Black communities. And why would you be proud of a family member joining the police? It's a dreadful thing to do. So the situation keeps getting worse instead of getting better. And we just need to keep working at trying to understand each other and bring people closer. You know, so that's largely why police forces cooperate with fly on the wall documentaries. The Met documentaries that were done over the last few years back with the BBC, loads of thought went into that, no editorial control, but really important to try and show things from the outside. There certainly were, and I hope still are, consultative groups in every borough in London, and should be at neighbourhood level as well. And while I was in the Met, we introduced a ride-along scheme so that members of the public, local politicians and so on, could go out on patrol with an officer and try and experience a bit of what it's like from the inside. Not that the police always get it right at all, but they have a difficult job to do. And the more the police and the public can understand each other, the more London and other cities and other areas of the country can be made safer by agencies and the public working together.
Helen, thank you very much. Umesh, thank you very much for joining us as well, and everybody else. It's been I think we've managed to keep it civil, which is good. Very briefly, I I've learned that there are only 3 other predominantly unarmed police forces in the world. That it takes 6 people, according to the training manual, to arrest anyone. That most corruption investigated by police is reported by the police. All amongst some really interesting points for which we have to thank Helen. And the other contributions that I've underlined in red, Giles is my namesakes on the importance of being clear as a public what we think success in police reform looks like, making it less reactive, more considered. And Umesh made the point that we do not have structured community engagement. We didn't get onto the question of whether that is simply a question of resources, but it's something that we should look into, and whether the mayor's efforts to monitor, stop and search with community groups ever amount to anything. Can the police restore public trust? I don't think we necessarily have a hard and fast answer to that, but I think we can all agree with Luke that we all have an interest in good people entering the force, and that would presumably be a very good way to start. It's 4 minutes past, the sun's out. If you have a chance to go out and enjoy it, well, it is in South London anyway, and either way, have a great weekend. Join us again on Monday when we have another Think In at 6:30, and this time next Friday for Sensemaker Live. Thanks all very much. Bye.